At the family gathering on my uncle's farm outside Columbus, my father lifted his glass to toast. To my sons, Brody and Easton, your career makes me proud. Applause and laughter filled the table. Then his eyes turned to me, voice calm but merciless. Lauren, you're 35 and still renting. Learn from your brothers. The laughter rose again, only this time, every echo cut straight through me. But the smiles didn't last long. Before I take you back to where this all began, tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever been the forgotten one at your own family's table, hit like and subscribe so we can walk through this together. I wasn't shocked by my father's words that night. They only echoed a silence I had carried all my life. We lived in a red brick house at the end of a narrow Columbus street where crabgrass won every summer and the swing in the yard tilted like a crooked smile. Inside roles were fixed. Ethan was brilliant, Caleb was sunshine, and I, Lauren, was the eldest daughter, the example. Responsibility was my inheritance. Praise belonged to the boys. On weekdays, the neighborhood hoop rattled under the Ohio sky while I stood at the sink wrists in dishwater scrubbing plates that weren't mine. Lauren, you're the big sister, Mom would say, ruffling Caleb's hair without looking at me. I learned to swallow words without sound. The house curated its memories like a museum that had no ticket for me. Frames multiplied Ethan holding ribbons. Caleb in a Little League cap, Mom and Dad dressed for church. My pictures began to vanish. First a class trip, then the ballet recital I once loved. Pale rectangles marked the empty spaces, proof that erasure could be quiet. Birthdays told the same story. Ethan's cakes blazed with sparklers. Caleb's parties spilled into the yard. For my 13th, the oven stayed cold. Mom set a candle in a square of cornbread and said, "Make a wish." I did not for gifts, just to be seen. The wish rose as smoke and vanished into the ceiling fan's steady hum. Dad Richard sold insurance and carried a polite voice home like a briefcase. He rarely raised it. Disappointment fell like dust, soft and everywhere. Report cards brought pizza for the boys and a ledger for me. You set the tone, Lauren. Don't let them down. Love wore the mask of duty. Punishments were mostly silent. If I argued, doors closed gently and stayed that way. Once after I helped a classmate and came home late, I found my dinner cold beneath plastic wrap. We ate hours ago, Mom said. Hunger, I told myself, was training for adulthood. Grandpa Edward was the breach in the wall. On Saturdays, I biked to his bungalow that smelled of lemon oil and pipe tobacco. He sat in a sunken leather armchair with a worn notebook on his lap, its pages crowded with dark blue handwriting. He called it a map from his Wall Street years, a record of storms survived and harbors found. When he caught me staring, he tapped at the cover. "Patience lives in here," he said. "And so do you." He taught me the market as others teach fishing, quiet ritual attention to the water. He spoke of cycles and seasons, of how noise drowned truth if you let it. Buy businesses, not tickers. Never risk rent for a rumor. Sleep on decisions. I didn't grasp every term, but I memorized the cadence of his calm. With him, the world slowed enough for me to belong. At home, belonging stayed conditional. When Ethan aced calculus, Dad brought home pizza. When Caleb scored, we went for ice cream. The night I earned an A in English after weeks with a teacher who thought my words were too quiet, Mom nodded without looking up and asked if I could drive Caleb to practice. "You're good at helping," he said kindly. I gripped the wheel and realized kindness can still be a cage. Jobs arrived before choices did. While friends taped posters to dorm walls, I folded polo shirts under fluorescent lights and counted tips at a diner off Route 23. Later, I typed invoices in a beige office where the clock's second hand dragged its feet. I brought home paychecks and slid thick envelopes toward bills I hadn't created. "You're a good girl," Mom said, and the words passed through me like steam. Grandpa kept a corner of his table clear for me. We built a paper portfolio first. Pretend buys, pretend sells notes in the margins. He made me write rules in my own hand, never rush. Never borrow bravado from someone else's win. Sleep on it. When I finally bought my first real shares, a dull Midwestern manufacturer with an ugly website and beautiful cash flow we celebrated with instant coffee. He lifted his mug and said, "Now you wait." Patience is hard to prove in a household that measures worth by volume. When I mentioned investing at dinner, Dad called it a distraction. Mom called it risky. Ethan quoted an econ article, and Caleb asked why I didn't just get into tech where the money is. I learned to say less. My account balance became a private weather system carrying storms alone. Sometimes the house itself felt like weather. Winter pressed its palm against the windows. The furnace sighed. The stairs groaned under duties that always found me first. I kept a shoebox under my bed, ticket stubs, a dried maple leaf, a magazine clipping about a woman who built her own fund. I didn't worship money. I craved permission. The idea that life could answer to conviction instead of headcount at a table. Not every memory was bleak. Caleb shared fries with me once. Ethan slipped a note under my door. Thanks for the ride. But the shape of our home stayed fixed. The spotlight rarely swung my way. Absence taught me to be present for myself. In the mirror, I practiced no without apology. In the journal Grandpa gave me, I wrote, I am not a role. I am a person. On my 20th birthday, Grandpa placed the leather notebook in my hands. The cover was cracked, the spine softened by years of opening. Inside were lessons and mistakes a garden planted long before I was born. On the first page, he'd written, To Lauren, be patient with markets and kinder with yourself. The page smelled like dust and hope. If you ask when this story began, it wasn't the night my father mocked me at the farm. It began here in a hallway of missing photographs in a kitchen where my sleeves stayed wet in a quiet bungalow where someone told me I wasn't invisible. It began with the ache of being asked to be an example and the stubborn choice to become one on my own terms. And maybe that's why years later, when the laughter rose around that long wooden table, it didn't just sting. It struck something already cracked, and the break finally spread. The laughter at Uncle James's farm didn't fade quickly. It lingered, rattling in my ears, each chuckle another reminder that in this family, I was the punchline. Lantern light flickered across faces that glowed with amusement while mine burned with a shame I had learned to swallow since childhood. I felt Daniel's hand brush mine under the table. A quiet signal, I see you. But that moment of comfort was drowned beneath the weight of every gaze fixed on me, not with pride, not even with disappointment anymore, but with dismissal. They had reduced my life to a joke, and the joke landed. For years I had endured such moments. Being the eldest meant being invisible when it mattered, responsible when it didn't. But something in me cracked that night, not loudly, not with an outburst, but with a silence so heavy it shifted the air itself. I lowered my fork, the scrape against the plate, slicing through the noise. My brothers noticed first. Ethan smirked, raising his glass as though to toast my failures again. Caleb leaned back satisfied with the chorus of laughter he had helped conduct. My mother adjusted her shawl, avoiding my eyes. My father reclined, certain his words carried the authority of truth, but I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. My silence was the rupture. It was the moment the weight of 35 years pressed too hard against the walls I had built inside. I remember staring at the tablecloth, the red and white checks blurred like blood across snow. In that blur, memories rose unbidden, the candle stub stuck in cornbread, the empty frames in the hallway, the sound of my name spoken only when there was work to do, a lifetime of being both necessary and unnecessary all at once. The farm's porch lights buzzed overhead, insects circling the glow, desperate to be near something that would burn them. I felt like one of them caught in an orbit I had never chosen. Grandpa Edward sat at the end of the table, quiet, frail, but his eyes fixed on me with the same steady light I had known since childhood. I didn't need to speak. He already knew. He leaned slightly on his cane, cleared his throat, and for the first time all evening the laughter stilled. "You're all wrong," he said. His voice trembled with age, but each word struck like a gavel. "Lauren is not renting. She owns her own home in Dublin, a 5-bedroom villa with a garden and pool. In her portfolio, it's worth more than $10 million. The silence that followed was thicker than any ridicule. Forks froze midway, glasses hovered, conversations died in their throats. My mother's hand shook, spilling a ribbon of red wine across the tablecloth. My father blinked as if the words were a language he had never learned. Ethan's smirk vanished, replaced by a stiff jaw. Caleb's face, usually glowing with self-assurance, drained pale. I should have felt triumphant, but what I felt was something colder. An exhaustion from carrying years of invisibility on my shoulders finally dropped into the light. I rose slowly, legs trembling, but voice calm. I wasn't going to say anything tonight. I began the air around me heavy with anticipation. But since Grandpa spoke, maybe it's time you know the truth. I told them about the envelopes of wages I'd slid across the counter while they bragged about scholarships and promotions. I spoke of shifts at the diner, the office, the store, while my dreams sat in notebooks no one asked about. I told them of the nights my account balance fell like a stone when my brothers laughed at me for wasting time and the mornings I chose patience anyway. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The hush at the table amplified every syllable. "I don't blame you," I said, looking directly at my father. "You taught me sacrifice, but you also taught me silence. And in that silence, I learned how to build something of my own." I could feel my mother's tears brimming. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Caleb stared at his plate as though it might offer escape. The rupture was complete. It wasn't an explosion, it was the quiet collapse of a wall I had kept standing too long. And in the rubble, for the first time, I could breathe. Silence has teeth. That night at Uncle James's farm, after the laughter died and my confession filled the air, I finally understood that. My family had mistaken my quiet for weakness, my patience for surrender. But silence, when sharpened, cuts deeper than any outburst. I didn't storm out. I didn't slam my chair against the floor. I stayed. I looked at each of them in turn, steady, unblinking, while their faces shifted from smugness to shock. The power had already changed hands, and I hadn't raised my voice once. For years, I'd been invisible, but invisibility had given me freedom. While Ethan strutted through college campuses and Caleb posted photos with his sports car, I was working double shifts, sliding envelopes of cash to cover bills and tucking away whatever remained into an account no one cared to ask about. I learned to live beneath notice like water seeping into cracks, patient, unstoppable. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "While you were laughing at me for working the register, I was buying my first shares. While you mocked my secondhand clothes, I was reading financial reports until dawn. And when you told me investing was foolish, I listened to Grandpa instead." I chose silence then. That silence is the reason I stand here now. No one dared interrupt. Even the children in the yard seemed to sense something had shifted. Their laughter drifted further away. I described the old notebook Grandpa had given me, the one filled with scrawled lines about patience, discipline, the dangers of greed. Every page felt like a secret I told them, and I kept it because I knew none of you would care enough to look. Their eyes followed me, trapped in the rhythm of my voice. I explained how I started small wages from the diner tips folded into 20s, buying shares in companies no one else bothered to notice. I didn't flaunt, didn't brag, didn't need anyone's approval. My portfolio grew in silence like a tree pushing roots deep underground where no one could see. Then came Daniel. My husband wasn't from wealth. He had no inheritance to offer, but he offered belief. He sat with me at our chipped kitchen table, studying reports, circling trends. "AI is the future," he'd said, tapping the screen of his laptop. I hesitated, clinging to safety, until Grandpa's voice returned to me. "Sometimes you must leave the harbor to find the ocean." So I sold everything I'd built over 10 years, every stock, every careful brick, and stepped into risk. It felt like tearing out my own ribs, but I did it. I poured everything into AI, trusting not luck, but discipline. The room seemed to shrink around me as I recounted the nights when prices fell 20% in a week, when I clenched my fists just to keep from selling, when I whispered to myself in the dark, "Patience, Lauren. Wait." And then the climb. The numbers swelling beyond anything I had ever imagined. The moment my account crossed 1 million. Then 2. Then 5. Until one morning, I opened my phone and saw more than 10 million staring back. I paused there, letting the silence carry the weight of those words. My father's face was stone, but his hands betrayed him trembling as he gripped the stem of his glass. My mother's tears had spilled freely, tracing the lines of her face. Ethan's jaw was locked tight, his confidence cracked. Caleb wouldn't meet my eyes at all. My silence, I said finally, was never defeat. It was strategy. While you were busy performing, I was building, and now I don't need your approval. I never did. The lantern light caught the rim of my glass as I lifted it slightly, not in toast, but in quiet defiance. No cheers followed, but I didn't need them. The stillness itself was proof. That was the counterattack they never saw coming. Not noise, not vengeance, but truth revealed at the precise moment it could no longer be ignored. And in their silence, I found my weapon. The silence after my words was not peace. It was the kind that hums like power lines before a storm. My father broke first. He leaned forward, his voice sharp, but laced with a forced chuckle. Well, investments come and go. You got lucky, Lauren, but don't think money erases the years of sacrifice this family gave you. His eyes bored into me as if daring me to deny a debt I never asked them to carry. My mother sniffled, pressing a napkin to her face. You've changed, she whispered, her voice trembling. We raised you to be humble, not boastful. Why shame your brothers in front of everyone? The guilt was rehearsed the same tone she used when I was young, when I wanted something of my own. Ethan slammed his palm lightly against the table, forcing a smile for the relatives watching. Come on, let's be realistic. AI, that bubble will burst in a year. You really think this, he gestured at me with a sharp flick of his hand, makes you smarter than me than us? His laugh was brittle, the kind that hides a fracture. Caleb finally raised his head, his grin crooked but his eyes restless. If you're so rich, Lauren, why still drive that old car? Why still dress like... He trailed off, glancing at his designer watch, realizing too late that the question sounded more like envy than mockery. The storm was gathering. Words flew at me like stones: luck, pride, betrayal, ingratitude. Relatives shifted uneasily, whispers stirring like dry leaves. Aunts, who had laughed at my father's toast, now looked away, unsure which side to take. Uncle James cleared his throat, trying to lighten the tension, but the air refused to move. I didn't flinch. I had lived inside this storm all my life, manipulation disguised as care dismissal, dressed as humor. Their voices were louder now, but no different than the silence that had shaped me as a child. My success isn't about money, I said quietly, steady enough to slice through the noise. It's about freedom, and that's something none of you can take from me. My father's face darkened. Freedom! He barked, his composure cracking. You think freedom means turning your back on family? Everything you have came from this house, from us teaching you discipline, sacrifice. You owe us. The word owe hung in the air, heavy, poisonous. But Grandpa Edward stirred in his chair before I could answer. His cane tapped the wooden porch floor once, twice. She owes you nothing, he said, voice thin but firm as steel. You all took from her for years. And she gave. She gave more than you ever saw. The table froze. My brothers shifted uncomfortably as if the ground had tilted beneath them. My mother's tears became sobs. Edward, please, she pleaded. You don't understand. Families have to stick together. No, Grandpa said. Families honor each other. And you've done nothing but dishonor her. The storm tried again. Ethan muttered about luck under his breath. Caleb fidgeted with his phone, texting someone, maybe desperate for an audience that still believed in his shine. My father gripped his glass so hard, the stem snapped, shards falling into his lap. A collective gasp swept through the table, but he waved it off his hand, trembling with more than wine. For once, I didn't rush to clean the mess. I watched. Calm, unblinking. My silence was louder than their noise. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. You can call it luck. You can call it betrayal. You can call it whatever helps you sleep. But the truth doesn't change. I built something you never thought I could, and the only shame here is how little you ever believed in me. The storm raged on, but it no longer touched me. Their accusations rolled off like rain on glass. I had walked too far, waited too long, endured too much to be dragged back into the role of the obedient eldest daughter. That night, the farm was filled with voices trying to claw me back into silence. But for the first time, I stood unshaken in the center of it. And storms, no matter how fierce, always burn themselves out. The storm at the table had spent itself into fragments, shards of glass, tear-streaked cheeks, brittle laughter no one truly felt. But storms don't end in quiet. They end with lightning. I stood slowly, the wooden chair legs groaning against the floorboards. Every eye turned to me, not with mockery this time, but with a wary expectation. I let the silence stretch long enough that the air itself seemed to lean closer. "You think my life is luck?" I said softly, though my words carried to every corner of the room. But luck doesn't keep you awake at night fighting panic while your account balance bleeds red. Luck doesn't drag you through double shifts at the diner or hours typing invoices in a beige office where no one remembers your name. Luck doesn't whisper in your ear, "Wait, wait," when everything in you screams to run. I turned toward Ethan. "You said I was foolish. But foolishness doesn't turn 10 years of wages into $10 million. What you call a bubble, I call discipline." Then to Caleb. "You asked why I still drive the old car. Because I don't measure my worth by what I wear on my wrist or what engine I park in the driveway. I measure it by freedom. The freedom to live without begging for approval at this table." Finally, I faced my parents. My mother's eyes shimmered with tears. My father's jaw tightened like stone. "You told me I was the eldest, that I had to give way, set an example. I did. I gave way to my brothers at every meal, every holiday, every conversation. I set an example you never cared to see. And while you erased me from photographs and handed out praise like it was inheritance, I built something no one could erase." My voice didn't rise, but it grew sharper, honed by years of silence. "I was never your failure. I was your shadow. And now the shadow stands taller than the house that cast it." Gasps rippled through the room. An aunt clasped her hands, whispering, "My God." Uncle James shifted uneasily, pride and discomfort warring across his face. Grandpa Edward's eyes glistened. He tapped his cane once, as if sealing my words into the floor itself. The stillness broke when Ethan muttered, "This isn't fair," but his voice faltered beneath the weight of the truth he could no longer outrun. Caleb lowered his gaze, shame replacing bravado. My mother reached for me, but the gesture came too late, her fingers curling into empty air. I inhaled slowly, feeling the cool autumn night pressing against the windows. I don't need applause. I don't need forgiveness. I only needed to say this out loud once. And with that, I set my napkin gently on the table, the fabric falling like a final curtain. The echo filled the room, heavier than any laughter, deeper than any praise they lost me. That was their punishment. I turned, and for the first time in my life, I walked away from my family, not as their daughter, their sister, their burden, but as myself. And in that silence, I was finally free. When I left the farmhouse that night, the laughter did not follow me. Only the sound of crickets in the field and the crunch of gravel under my shoes kept me company as Daniel walked beside me in silence, his hand steady on mine. Above us, the Ohio sky stretched wide and black lantern light fading into stars. For the first time in my life, the quiet didn't sting, it healed. The drive home was wordless. Daniel glanced at me once, his expression proud but soft, and that was enough. I didn't need celebration. I had carried the weight of invisibility for 35 years, and tonight I had set it down. In the days that followed, the family fractured in ways I had never seen before. Phone calls came stilted, awkward, heavy, with unspoken apologies. Ethan left me a voicemail I didn't understand. I was wrong. Caleb sent a message late one night, just 3 words. "I'm sorry, sis." Even my mother knocked on my door with trembling hands, her eyes swollen from tears. "Lauren," she whispered, "I see you now." But I didn't answer right away. For once, I allowed their words to wait. Patience had always been my greatest weapon now. It was my boundary. At home, life bloomed in ways more powerful than any apology. The garden outside my villa filled with late autumn light. Daniel and I repainted the nursery walls a gentle blue for the twins we were waiting to welcome. The air smelled of cinnamon and leaves, and for the first time the future felt like mine to hold. Grandpa Edward visited one afternoon leaning on his cane, his leather notebook under his arm. He sat in the garden while I poured tea. "You spoke your truth?" He said, his voice raspy but proud. "And truth is the only inheritance that matters." He pressed the notebook into my hands once more. "Now you teach them Lauren. Not to win their approval, but to show them a different way." Weeks passed, and slowly the hostility turned to silence, then to tentative attempts at connection. Ethan asked me to explain the basics of investing, his voice stripped of arrogance. Caleb, nervous but genuine, admitted his job was not the dream he made it seem. For the first time, they weren't my rivals. They were simply my brothers lost in their own storms, searching for anchors. I realized then that my story was never just about money or even revenge. It was about reclaiming my voice, about standing in the open where I had once been erased. It was about choosing freedom over approval, truth over silence. One night, as I rocked gently on the porch swing, Daniel's hand resting over mine and the twins shifting softly in my belly, I understood the full echo of that evening at the farm. The family I grew up in may never fully heal, but I had healed. And that was enough. Some wounds leave scars, yes. But scars don't just mark the pain, they prove survival. And if you asked me now, I'd tell you this silence can destroy you, or it can sharpen you. For me, it became my blade. And in that silence, I finally found peace. When silence becomes heavier than words, what would you choose, walk away or speak? Tell me your truth below. I'm listening.